Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's story. Your likes and subscriptions can give me hope to create better stories. Chapter 1: The Weight of the Double Crown. In the time when the great river Nile flowed as it flows today, carrying the whispers of eternity between its banks, there lived a young pharaoh named Kamwaset. His name meant he who appears in Thebes, and like the gentle dawn that appears each morning over the eastern desert, he ruled with quiet strength and endless responsibility. The palace of Memphis stood tall against the star-filled sky, its limestone walls glowing softly in the moonlight. Within these ancient walls, Pharaoh Kamwaset sat in his private chamber, the weight of the double crown heavy upon his brow. The crown itself was a marvel to behold, the white crown of Upper Egypt rising like a tall lotus bloom, united with the red crown of Lower Egypt, curved like the protective cobra that guarded all pharaohs. Together, they symbolized his rule over all the lands from the first cataract of the Nile to the Mediterranean Sea. But tonight, as every night, the crown felt heavier than gold, heavier than the pyramids themselves. For to be Pharaoh was to carry not just a crown, but the dreams, hopes, and very lives of millions of people. Each decision he made rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, affecting farmers in distant villages, craftsmen in bustling markets, and children playing along the riverbanks. The pharaoh's day had begun, as always, before the first light touched the horizon. In the sacred ritual chamber, the high priests had awakened him with gentle chants that echoed through the corridors like a mother's lullaby. They dressed him in fine linen, whiter than clouds, and placed upon his feet sandals of gold and leather. Around his neck they hung the sacred amulets, the Ankh for life, the Was scepter for power, and the Jed pillar for stability. Each piece of regalia was not merely decoration, but a sacred trust, a reminder of his divine connection to the gods. As the sun god Ra began his daily journey across the sky, Kamwaset had taken his place in the great throne room. The throne itself was a work of art that took master craftsmen years to complete. Carved from cedar wood, imported from distant Lebanon, it was covered in gold leaf and adorned with turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian. The arms of the throne were carved to represent the fierce protection of lions, while the back showed the eternal symbol of unified Egypt. The papyrus plant of Lower Egypt intertwined with the lotus flower of Upper Egypt. One by one, his advisors had approached the throne, each bearing matters that required his attention. The vizier, his most trusted minister, spoke in measured tones about the year's flood predictions. The Nile's annual flooding was the lifeblood of Egypt, and its timing and height determined whether the kingdom would feast or face famine. This year, the sacred nilometers, built along the river's banks, indicated a perfect flood, not too high to destroy villages, not too low to leave fields barren. "My lord," the vizier had said, bowing deeply, "the priests at Elephantine Island report that the floodwaters are rising exactly as the ancient texts predicted. The God Happy blesses us with his abundance this year." Kamwaset nodded, feeling a moment of relief wash through him like cool water. A good flood meant happy people, full granaries, and peaceful borders. But even in this good news lay the seeds of new responsibilities. He would need to ensure that the excess grain was properly stored, that taxes were fairly collected, and that the surplus was wisely distributed to maintain Egypt's prosperity through the lean years that would inevitably come. The master builder then approached, his hands stained with the honest dirt of construction sites. He spoke of the great temple being built at Karnak, dedicated to Amun-Ra, king of the gods. The temple was not just a place of worship, but a statement of Egypt's eternal strength, its columns reaching toward the heavens like stone prayers. Each block of sandstone had to be quarried, shaped, transported, and lifted into place by skilled workers who took pride in creating something that would outlast their own lives. The sacred pool is nearly complete, divine one, the master builder reported. The workers sing as they labor, knowing they build for eternity. But Kamwaset knew the true cost of such monuments. Each stone represented hours of human labor. Each decorated wall required the finest artists, and each sacred text carved in hieroglyphs demanded the skills of learned scribes who had spent years mastering the ancient writing. The Pharaoh was not just a ruler, but a keeper of culture, responsible for preserving and advancing the arts, sciences, and spiritual traditions that made Egypt the wonder of the ancient world. As the day wore on, a messenger arrived from the southern border, dusty from hard travel. He brought news of Nubian traders seeking to establish new trade agreements for gold and exotic woods. The Pharaoh had to weigh not just the economic benefits, but the political implications. Egypt's wealth came not only from the fertile Nile Valley, but from its position at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Every trade agreement was also a diplomatic relationship that had to be carefully maintained. The afternoon brought audiences with local governors from distant provinces, each with their own challenges and needs. A governor from the Delta region spoke of canals that needed dredging to maintain proper irrigation. Another, from the desert oases, requested additional guards to protect caravans from bandits. Each request was reasonable, each need was real, but the Pharaoh's resources, while vast, were not infinite. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Kamwaset met with his personal scribe to review correspondence from other kingdoms. A letter from the Hittite king required careful consideration. It spoke of mutual defense agreements and marriage alliances that could secure Egypt's northern borders for generations. Another message from a Mesopotamian ruler offered exotic goods in exchange for Egypt's grain and gold. The weight of these decisions pressed down upon the Pharaoh's shoulders like the stone lid of a sarcophagus. Unlike a merchant who risked only his own fortune, or a farmer who tended only his own fields, the Pharaoh's every choice affected the destiny of an entire civilization. A wrong decision about trade could lead to economic hardship. A poor military choice could mean invasion and conquest. A mistake in religious matters could, the people believed, anger the gods and bring disaster upon the land. Yet perhaps the heaviest burden of all was the knowledge that he could never truly rest. Even in sleep, the Pharaoh's dreams were filled with the faces of his people. He dreamed of farmers hoping for good harvests, of mothers praying for their children's health, of soldiers far from home defending Egypt's borders. The crown that symbolized his divine authority also bound him to serve every person in his kingdom, from the wealthiest nobles to the humblest servants. As evening approached, Kamiset had walked through the palace gardens, seeking a moment of peace among the carefully tended lotus pools and sycamore trees. The gardens were designed to reflect the eternal paradise promised in the afterlife, with orderly paths, fountains that caught and reflected the starlight, and flower beds arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Even here, though, he could not escape his responsibilities. The head gardener approached to discuss plans for expanding the medicinal herb gardens that supplied the palace physicians. The pharaoh's evening meal was served on plates of gold and silver, accompanied by fine wines from the finest vineyards in the delta. But even this luxury carried its weight. The elaborate dining rituals, the floral prayers before each course, the careful attention to protocol, all served to reinforce his divine status while simultaneously reminding him that he was never simply a man enjoying a meal. He was always the pharaoh, always on display, always representing something greater than himself. After dinner, the royal astronomers came to present their observations of the night sky. In ancient Egypt, the movement of stars and planets was believed to influence earthly events, and the pharaoh needed to understand these celestial patterns to make wise decisions. Tonight, they spoke of Venus rising brightly in the west, a favorable sign for diplomatic ventures. They pointed out the constellation they called the Boat of Ra, which would guide the sun god safely through the underworld until dawn. As Kamwazet finally retired to his private chambers, his personal servants helped him remove the formal regalia of kingship. The golden collar, the ceremonial sword, the royal kilt with its pleated linen and golden belt. Each item was carefully stored away until it would be needed again tomorrow. But even without these physical symbols of power, the weight of responsibility remained. The pharaoh's bedroom was a sanctuary decorated with scenes from the Book of the Dead, showing the journey of souls through the afterlife. The walls displayed beautiful paintings of fields of reeds where the blessed dead could find eternal rest, working and playing in perfect harmony. These images were meant to be comforting, but tonight they only reminded Kamwazet of how far he was from such peace. As he lay upon his bed, made with the finest linen sheets and soft down pillows, the pharaoh stared up at the ceiling, painted with stars to mirror the night sky. He thought of his father, who had ruled before him, and his grandfather before that. Each had carried this same burden, made these same difficult choices, felt this same weight pressing down upon their souls. The sacred scribes recorded that pharaohs were gods on earth, divine beings who could commune with the deities and ensure Ma'at, the cosmic order and balance that kept the universe functioning properly. But lying in the darkness, Kemwaset felt very human indeed. He felt the loneliness of command, the isolation that came with power, and the deep responsibility that never allowed him to think only of himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The priests would wake him again before dawn for the daily rituals that maintained his connection to the gods. The vizier would arrive with new reports and decisions that needed to be made. Ambassadors would come seeking audiences, governors would request resources, and the endless work of ruling the greatest civilization in the world would continue. But for now, in the quiet darkness of his chamber, Pharaoh Kemwaset closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember what it felt like to be simply a man. He remembered his childhood, when his greatest worry was mastering the complex hieroglyphic writing system under the watchful eye of his tutors. He remembered the joy of learning about Egypt's great history, of hearing stories about the pyramid builders and the brave pharaohs who had expanded Egypt's borders to create this mighty kingdom. Those memories brought a gentle smile to his lips as sleep began to approach like a kind friend. For tomorrow, he would once again bear the weight of the double crown and all it represented. But tonight, for just a few precious hours, he could rest. The soft sound of the Nile flowing past the palace walls created a gentle rhythm, like a giant heartbeat that had pulsed through Egypt for thousands of years. This eternal river had nurtured countless pharaohs before him and would continue long after his own journey to the afterlife. In this continuity, Kemwaset found a measure of peace. He was part of something greater than himself, a divine dynasty that stretched back to the very gods themselves. As his breathing deepened and his mind began to drift toward sleep, the pharaoh whispered a quiet prayer to Pa, the creator god of Memphis, thanking him for the strength to serve and asking for wisdom to rule justly. The prayer dissolved into the night air like incense, carrying his hopes and dreams toward the stars that watched over Egypt with eternal patience. The weight of the crown would return with the dawn, but for now, in the embrace of approaching sleep, even a pharaoh could find a moment of rest. Chapter 2: The River of Dreams. In the deep hours of the night, when Ra traveled through the underworld in his sacred boat, Pharaoh Kemwaset found himself standing not in his palace chamber, but on the deck of a golden barge floating gently down the eternal Nile. This was the River of Dreams, where mortal concerns dissolved like mist, and the soul could wander freely through memories and visions. The Dream Nile was more beautiful than even the earthly river that blessed Egypt. Its waters sparkled with starlight, and lotus flowers as large as shields bloomed along its banks, their petals glowing with soft, pearl-like radiance. The air was filled with the gentle sound of water lapping against the golden hull of the pharaoh's dream vessel. A sound so soothing it seemed to wash away the accumulated stress of countless royal decisions. On this magical barge, Kemwaset was not alone. The boat was guided by Anubis, the jackal-headed god who protected souls on their journeys through the afterlife. But in this dream, Anubis appeared not as the stern judge of the dead, but as a gentle guide with eyes that held the wisdom of eternity and the compassion of a loving guardian. "My lord Pharaoh," Anubis spoke, his voice carrying the deep resonance of distant thunder mixed with the comfort of a father's words. "You carry heavy burdens in the waking world. Here, in the realm of dreams, let us explore why the gods chose you for this sacred task, and why your sacrifices serve a purpose greater than personal happiness." As they drifted along the dream river, the banks began to show scenes from Egypt's glorious past. Kamwaset saw the first pharaoh, Narmer, who united Upper and Lower Egypt into one mighty kingdom over 3,000 years ago. The scene unfolded like a living painting. Narmer stood tall and proud, holding the enemies of Egypt by their hair, while raising his ceremonial mace. But in the dream vision, Kamwaset could see beyond the symbol of conquest to the man beneath the crown. Narmer, too, had felt the weight of uniting two different peoples with their own customs, gods, and ways of life. The pharaoh watched as the ancient king spent sleepless nights planning how to merge the agricultural traditions of the Delta with the desert wisdom of the South. He saw Narmer struggling with the same questions that plagued rulers throughout time. How to be firm enough to maintain order while being gentle enough to win hearts. How to honor tradition while adapting to new challenges. "Every pharaoh has walked this path," Anubis explained as they continued their peaceful journey. "The crown is not a reward, but a calling. It is not given to those who seek power, but to those who can bear responsibility." The dream barge passed a magnificent scene showing the bedding of the Great Pyramid at Giza during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu. But instead of focusing on the completed monument, the vision showed the human side of this incredible achievement. Kamwaset observed thousands of workers, not slaves as many would later believe, but free citizens of Egypt who took pride in their contribution to eternity. The pharaoh watched master stonemasons teaching their craft to eager apprentices, their hands guiding younger hands to shape limestone blocks with perfect precision. He saw the camp where workers lived during the construction, complete with bakeries that produced fresh bread daily, breweries that provided beer rations, and medical facilities where skilled physicians treated injuries and illnesses. The workers sang as they labored, their voices rising in harmony as they pulled massive stones up the pyramid's ramps. But most remarkably, Kamwaset could see Pharaoh Khufu himself among the workers, not in royal regalia, but in simple linen, his hands dirty from personally inspecting the work. The king spoke with individual craftsmen, learning their names and the names of their families. He understood that this pyramid, meant to ensure his own eternal afterlife, would only succeed through the willing cooperation of his people. "See how he serves by leading," Anubis pointed out gently. "A pharaoh who builds monuments to his own glory will create hollow tombs, but one who builds dreams that his people can share creates wonders that endure for millennia." The scene shifted to show another pharaoh, the great Amenhotep III, during the height of Egypt's prosperity. His reign was marked not by military conquests, but by unprecedented artistic and cultural achievements. In the dream vision, Khemwaset watched this ancient king in his palace workshop, personally consulting with master craftsmen about the design of temples and statues. Amenhotep III understood that Egypt's true power lay not just in its military might or economic wealth, but in its ability to create beauty that inspired awe and reverence in people from distant lands. The pharaoh observed as foreign ambassadors gasped in wonder at the artistic treasures of Thebes, their amazement growing Egypt's influence more effectively than any army could. But the dream also revealed the personal cost of such greatness. Amenhotep III, like Khemwaset, often worked late into the night, reviewing plans and making decisions that would affect generations. The king consulted with priests about proper religious observances, with architects about building projects that would employ thousands of workers, and with diplomats about maintaining peaceful relationships with neighboring kingdoms. Leadership is not about commanding others, Anubis observed as they watched the ancient pharaoh carefully considering a trade agreement that would benefit both Egypt and its neighbors. True leadership is about serving something greater than oneself. As their dream journey continued, the golden barge approached a particularly beautiful stretch of the river, where the banks were lined with temples glowing with soft, eternal light. Here, Khemwaset encountered the spirit of Hatshepsut, one of the most remarkable pharaohs in Egypt's long history. She had ruled not as a queen regent, but as a pharaoh in her own right, wearing the false beard of kingship and making decisions that secured Egypt's prosperity for decades. In the dream realm, Hatshepsut appeared as she truly was, a wise and strong leader whose innovative approaches to governance had brought unprecedented peace and prosperity to Egypt. She had chosen to build rather than wage war, to explore rather than conquer, and to create rather than destroy. My young successor, Hatshepsut spoke with a voice like gentle morning breeze. I see in your dreams the same struggles I faced. The burden of the crown is that it transforms the one who wears it. We cease to be individuals and become symbols, living embodiments of Egypt itself. She showed Khemwaset visions of her own reign, including the famous trading expedition to the mysterious land of Punt. The pharaoh watched as Egyptian ships returned, loaded not with gold taken by conquest, but with exotic trees, aromatic resins, and wonderful animals obtained through peaceful trade. The people of Egypt rejoiced not because they had defeated enemies, but because their pharaoh had brought them marvels from distant lands. But why is this burden placed? The dream scene shifted to show Egypt during times when weak leadership or divided rule had brought chaos to the kingdom. Khemwaset witnessed the intermediate periods when Egypt was fragmented, when local governors fought each other while foreign invaders threatened the borders. He saw famine spreading when there was no central authority to coordinate the distribution of grain from rich provinces to poor ones. He observed temples falling into ruin, when there was no pharaoh to organize their maintenance and ensure proper religious observances. The pharaoh is the keystone that holds the arch of civilization in place, Hatshepsut explained. Remove the keystone, and even the strongest arch will collapse. We bear this burden not for our own glory, but to prevent the suffering that comes with chaos. The golden barge now approached the most sacred section of the Dream Nile, where the water itself seemed to glow with divine light. Here, great Pharaoh Akhenaten appeared, though he looked very different from the traditional depictions carved in stone. In the dream realm, his features were kind and thoughtful rather than austere, and his eyes held the deep sadness of a man who had tried to change the world and paid a heavy price for his vision. I attempted to transform Egypt overnight, Akhenaten said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. I believed that a pharaoh's will alone could reshape an entire civilization, but I learned that true change must grow like the Nile flood, gradually and naturally, or it will recede just as quickly as it came. Through dream visions, Kamwazit saw Akhenaten's revolutionary reign when the pharaoh had attempted to transform Egypt's ancient polytheistic religion into worship of a single god, the Aten. The attempt had ultimately failed, but not because it was entirely wrong. Rather, it had moved too quickly, asking people to abandon traditions that had sustained them for centuries without providing adequate time for new beliefs to take root. I thought that being pharaoh meant having the power to reshape reality according to my vision, Akhenaten continued. But I discovered that even pharaohs must work within the flow of time and tradition. We are gardeners, not magicians. We can plant seeds and tend them carefully, but we cannot force flowers to bloom before their season. The lesson was profound but gentle, delivered with the compassion of someone who understood the temptations and pressures of absolute power. Kamwazet began to understand that his daily struggles with balancing competing interests and moving slowly on important decisions were not signs of weakness, but evidence of wisdom. As the dream barge continued its peaceful journey, they encountered Ramesses II, known to history as Ramesses the Great. But here in the realm of dreams, he appeared not in his famous battle scenes or colossal statues, but as an elderly man sitting quietly by the riverbank, feeding sacred ibis birds that had come to trust his gentle presence. "My young friend," Ramesses said, looking up from the birds with eyes that twinkled with humor and hard-earned wisdom. "I lived 96 years and ruled for 66 of them. I built more temples and monuments than any pharaoh before or after me. I fought great battles and signed historic peace treaties. But do you know what I remember most clearly?" Kamwazet shook his head, genuinely curious. "I remember the small moments," Ramesses continued. "Scattering more grain for the birds. A young scribe who finally mastered a difficult hieroglyph and beamed with pride. A farmer's daughter who brought me wildflowers from her family's field. An old priest who blessed me with tears of joy in his eyes because I had funded repairs to his village temple." The great pharaoh stood slowly, his dream form radiating the contentment that comes from a life fully lived. The monuments will crumble. The battles will be forgotten. But the lives we touch with kindness create ripples that flow through eternity like the Nile itself. This revelation washed over Kamwaset like cool water on a hot day. He had been so focused on the great responsibilities and momentous decisions that he had forgotten the simple human connections that made leadership meaningful. The individual conversations, the personal attention to small details, the moments when a pharaoh could brighten someone's day with a word of encouragement or recognition. The dream river now carried them toward a magnificent temple complex that seemed to be built from light itself. Here, they were greeted by Thutmose III, the pharaoh historians would call the Napoleon of ancient Egypt for his brilliant military campaigns. In the dream realm, he appeared not as a warrior, but as a scholar, surrounded by scrolls and maps, planning not conquests, but expeditions of discovery and cultural exchange. Young Pharaoh, Thutmose III, said with the enthusiasm of an eternal student, "They remember me for the battles I won, but I was proudest of the libraries I built and the knowledge I preserved. Every military campaign I conducted was ultimately in service of protecting Egypt's ability to learn, grow, and create." Through dream visions, Kamwaset saw that even Egypt's military might was not exercised for its own sake, but to create the stability necessary for civilization to flourish. Thutmose III had indeed expanded Egypt's borders, but he had done so to secure trade routes, protect Egyptian merchants, and ensure that knowledge could flow freely between different cultures. A pharaoh must sometimes be a warrior, Thutmose III explained, but only so that he can more often be a teacher, a builder, and a protector of peace. As the night deepened and the dream journey continued, Anubis guided the golden barge toward the most sacred destination of all, the island of flame, where the creator god Atum was said to have first emerged from the primordial waters to begin the creation of the universe. Here, in this holiest of places, Kamwaset would receive the deepest wisdom about his role as pharaoh. The island appeared not as a place of fire and intensity, but as a garden of indescribable beauty where every flower, every tree, every blade of grass glowed with inner light. At the center of this garden stood a simple but elegant pavilion where a figure awaited them. This was not Atum in his role as creator, but as the eternal teacher who helped souls understand their purpose in the cosmic order. "Welcome, child of my creation," Atum spoke with a voice like distant music. "Gentle, but infinitely powerful. You have traveled through dreams and visions to understand the sacred burden you carry. Now let me show you the greatest secret of pharaohship, that to rule others well, you must first learn to rule yourself." The creator god gestured, and the pavilion filled with soft light that revealed not grand visions of kingdoms and conquests, but simple scenes of daily life in ancient Egypt. Farmers working in their fields, craftsmen perfecting their art, mothers teaching children, priests conducting ceremonies that brought comfort to believers, scholars preserving knowledge for future generations. Every pharaoh who truly succeeded understood this truth, Atum explained. The kingdom is not separate from the king. The health of Egypt, this was the deepest teaching of all, and it came not through dramatic revelation, but through gentle understanding. Kaimzet realized that his nightly struggles with the weight of responsibility were not unique to him, but were part of the eternal process by which leaders grow into wisdom. Every pharaoh who had truly served Egypt well had walked this same path of inner development. As dawn began to approach in the waking world, the dream vision of the island of flame began to fade, but not before Atum offered one final gift, a vision of Egypt as it could be when ruled by a pharaoh who had learned to balance power with humility, authority with service, and command with compassion. This was the deepest teaching of all, and it came not through dramatic revelation, but through gentle understanding. Kamwaset realized that his nightly struggles with the weight of responsibility were not unique to him, but were part of the eternal process by which leaders grow into wisdom. Every pharaoh who had truly served Egypt well had walked this same path of inner development. As dawn began to approach in the waking world, the dream vision of the island of flame began to fade, but not before Atum offered one final gift, a vision of Egypt as it could be when ruled by a pharaoh who had learned to balance power with humility, authority with service, and command with compassion. As the dream realm faded and the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows of his palace chamber, Pharaoh Kaimwaset carried with him the wisdom of his predecessors and the deep peace that comes from understanding one's true purpose in the cosmic order. The weight of the crown would return with full consciousness, but now he would bear it differently, not as a burden imposed upon him, but as a sacred trust that connected him to the eternal flow of divine wisdom and love. Chapter 3. The Sacred Balance. As the first golden rays of Ra's sun began to paint the eastern sky, Pharaoh Kamwaset stirred gently in his bed, carrying the profound peace of his dream journey into the waking world. But before he fully awakened to resume his earthly duties, the gods granted him one more vision, a deeper understanding of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, justice, and balance that was the foundation of all Egyptian civilization. In this liminal space between sleeping and waking, Kamwaset found himself standing in the Hall of Two Truths, the sacred chamber where souls were judged in the afterlife. But this was not the stern, frightening tribunal that many imagined. Instead, the hall appeared as a place of infinite wisdom and gentle understanding, its walls decorated with scenes of perfect harmony between all living things. At the center of the hall stood Ma'at herself, the goddess of truth and justice, her ostrich feather crown glowing with soft, pure light. She was beautiful, not in the way of earthly beauty, but with the radiance that comes from absolute honesty and perfect wisdom. Her presence filled the hall with a sense of deep peace and rightness, like the feeling of coming home after a long journey. "My dear Pharaoh," Ma'at spoke, her voice carrying the resonance of absolute truth spoken with infinite compassion. "You have learned much about the burdens of leadership, but now you must understand why these burdens exist, and how they serve the greater good of all creation. With a gesture of her graceful hand, Ma'at caused the hall to fill with a gentle golden mist that gradually cleared to reveal the entire cosmos laid out before them. Kamwazet could see not just Egypt, but all the lands and peoples of the world, all the creatures of earth and sea and sky, all existing in a vast web of interconnection and mutual dependence. Observe, Ma'at said softly, how every element of creation serves not just itself, but the whole. The Nile floods not only to nourish Egypt, but to carry life-giving silt that feeds countless creatures. The sun rises not only to bring light, but to power the eternal cycle of growth and renewal that sustains all life. Even the desert, which seems harsh and barren, serves its purpose by creating the boundaries that protect Egypt's fertile valley. As Kamwaset watched this cosmic vision, he began to understand that his role as Pharaoh was part of this same universal pattern. Just as every star had its place in the heavens, and every creature had its role in the great web of life, the Pharaoh existed to maintain the delicate balance that allowed civilization to flourish. Ma'at guided his attention to focus more closely on Egypt itself, and Kamwaset saw his kingdom as if from the perspective of the gods. The vision revealed the intricate web of relationships and dependencies that made Egyptian civilization possible. Farmers in the Delta grew grain that fed craftsmen in Memphis. Miners in the southern deserts extracted gold that enabled trade with distant lands. Priests in countless temples maintained the spiritual practices that gave meaning and purpose to millions of lives. See how each person's work supports all the others, Ma'at explained. The Pharaoh's role is to be the heart of this great body, pumping life and energy to every part while maintaining the rhythm that keeps everything in harmony. The goddess then showed him visions of what happened when this balance was disrupted. Kamwaset saw periods in Egypt's history when weak or selfish rulers had allowed the delicate equilibrium to collapse. Regional governors who prioritized their own wealth over their people's welfare. Military commanders who launched unnecessary wars for personal glory. Priests who accumulated power at the expense of their spiritual duties. In each case, the breakdown of Ma'at at the top of society had rippled downward like cracks in a dam, eventually causing widespread suffering and chaos. Farmers abandoned their fields when they couldn't trust that their hard work would be justly rewarded. Craftsmen stopped creating beautiful objects when quality and skill were no longer valued. Scholars ceased their studies when knowledge was no longer respected and preserved. But the vision also showed the reverse process. How a pharaoh dedicated to Ma'at could restore harmony and prosperity even after periods of decline. Kamwaset watched as wise rulers rebuilt trust through consistent justice, restored prosperity through careful management of resources, and renewed cultural vitality by supporting arts, learning, and spiritual development. This is why the crown is heavy, Ma'at said gently. It carries not just gold and jewels, but the responsibility for maintaining cosmic order in the human realm. Every decision you make, either strengthens or weakens the web of relationships that holds your civilization together. The goddess then led Kamwaset through a series of deeper teachings about the nature of true kingship. She showed him that effective leadership was not about imposing one's will upon others, but about understanding the natural patterns of human society and working within them to create conditions for flourishing. In one vision, he observed a wise pharaoh dealing with a dispute between two provinces over water rights during a year of low flood. Rather than simply making an arbitrary decision, the king brought together farmers, engineers, and priests to study the problem carefully. They developed a system of rotating access to irrigation channels that ensured both provinces could survive the difficult year while building infrastructure that would prevent future conflicts. True leadership, Ma'at explained, is like the work of a master gardener. You cannot force plants to grow, but you can create the conditions: good soil, adequate water, proper sunlight that allow their natural growth to flourish. Similarly, you cannot force people to be good, but you can create social conditions that encourage virtue and discourage vice. Another vision showed a pharaoh faced with the challenge of integrating foreign refugees who had fled to Egypt to escape war in their homeland. Some advisors counseled sending the refugees away to avoid problems with Egyptian workers who feared competition for jobs. Others suggested forcing the newcomers to completely abandon their own customs and beliefs. But the wise pharaoh chose a different path. He established special districts where the refugees could maintain their cultural traditions while learning Egyptian customs. He created work programs that utilized their unique skills. Some were expert metalworkers, others had knowledge of new agricultural techniques in ways that benefited the entire kingdom. Most importantly, he required both Egyptian and foreign children to attend schools where they learned from each other, creating bonds that would strengthen Egypt for generations to come. Wisdom knows that diversity strengthens rather than weakens a kingdom, Ma'at observed. Like a garden that thrives when many different plants grow together, each contributing its unique gifts to the health of the whole. As these teachings continued, Kamwasit began to understand that what had seemed like impossible burdens were actually opportunities for spiritual growth and service. Each difficult decision that kept him awake at night was a chance to align himself more perfectly with the cosmic principles of truth and justice. Every sacrifice of personal comfort for the good of his people was a step along the path toward divine wisdom. Ma'at then showed him the most profound vision of all, the eternal perspective from which the gods viewed mortal life. From this cosmic viewpoint, individual human lives appeared like brief flames that flared brightly and then faded. But each flame contributed its light to an eternal tapestry of illumination that stretched across all of time. See how even the shortest life has meaning when it burns with purpose, Ma'at said softly. And see how a pharaoh's life, dedicated to serving others, creates light that continues to shine long after the physical flame has been extinguished. Kamwaset watched in wonder as he saw the continuing influence of great pharaohs throughout Egypt's history. The temples they built continued to provide spiritual comfort to countless generations. The legal codes they established continued to ensure justice for the poor and powerless. The cultural traditions they supported continued to give meaning and beauty to ordinary lives. But perhaps most remarkably, he saw how the personal example of wisdom and service set by good pharaohs had inspired countless individuals to live better lives themselves. A pharaoh who showed mercy and judgment encouraged his judges to be merciful. A pharaoh who lived simply despite his wealth inspired his people to value character over possessions. A pharaoh who treated all people with dignity, regardless of their station. This is the greatest secret of kingship, Ma'at revealed. You rule not primarily through laws and commands, but through the power of your example. When you embody the virtues you wish to see in your kingdom, those virtues spread naturally throughout your realm. The goddess then showed Kamaset a vision of his own future legacy. But it was not what he might have expected. He saw not grand monuments bearing his name or military victories that would be remembered for millennia. Instead, he saw the countless small acts of kindness and wisdom that would ripple outward through time. He watched a young scribe who had been inspired by the pharaoh's respect for learning grow up to become a great teacher himself, passing knowledge to hundreds of students. He observed a farmer whose family had been saved from starvation by the pharaoh's wise grain distribution policies teach his own children the importance of sharing with those in need. He witnessed a craftsman who had been justly rewarded for his skill become a master who trained others to create works of beauty that would endure for thousands of years. True immortality, Ma'at explained, comes not from having your name carved in stone, but from living in such a way that the goodness you embody continues to flow through the world long after your physical form has returned to the earth. As the vision continued, Khamuset began to see his daily struggles in an entirely new light. The difficult decisions that had seemed like burdens were actually opportunities to plant seeds of wisdom and justice that would bear fruit for generations. The personal sacrifices that had felt like losses were actually investments in the eternal values that made civilization possible. The goddess showed him one final teaching, a vision of the pharaoh's role in the cosmic order. He saw how earthly kingdoms like Egypt were training grounds where souls could learn to embody divine principles through the practice of wise leadership and faithful service. Every challenge faced by a pharaoh was an opportunity to grow in wisdom, compassion, and understanding of the divine will. The crown you wear is not just a symbol of earthly authority, Ma'at said. It is a sacred tool for spiritual development, both for yourself and for all those whose lives you touch. Through the practice of righteous rulership, you prepare your soul for ever greater service in the eternal realms. As this profound teaching settled into Khamuset's consciousness, he felt a fundamental shift in his understanding of his role. The weight of the crown remained, but it no longer felt like a burden imposed upon him from outside. Instead, it had become a sacred opportunity to participate in the divine work of creating harmony and justice in the world. The Hall of Two Truths began to fade as the light of dawn grew stronger in the waking world. But Ma'at offered one final gift, a blessing that would sustain the Pharaoh through all his future challenges. "Remember, beloved Pharaoh," she said, her voice becoming like a gentle breeze that would whisper in his heart whenever he faced difficult decisions. "You are never alone in carrying this responsibility. Every time you choose truth over convenience, justice over personal advantage, and service over self-interest, you align yourself with the eternal power that holds the universe together. Draw strength from this connection, and you will find that even the heaviest crown becomes light when it is worn in service to the divine order." As the vision faded and Kamwaset felt himself returning to normal waking consciousness, he carried with him a deep sense of peace and purpose. The sacred balance of Ma'at was not something external that he had to impose upon his kingdom through force or cunning. It was the natural state of harmony that emerged when all beings, from pharaohs to farmers, lived in alignment with truth, justice, and compassion. The sound of morning prayers being chanted in the palace temple reached his ears, and Kemaset smiled gently as he realized that even this daily ritual was part of the great web of practices that maintained Ma'at throughout Egyptian civilization. Every prayer offered with sincere devotion, every act of kindness performed without expectation of reward, every moment of honest work done with care and skill, all of these contributed to the cosmic balance that allowed their society to flourish. As he lay in his bed for these final moments before beginning another day of royal duties, Pharaoh Kemaset felt not the heavy anticipation of burdens to be carried, but the quiet joy of sacred work to be done. He understood now that his sleepless nights and difficult decisions were not signs that something was wrong, but evidence that he was fulfilling his divine purpose. The teaching of Ma'at had shown him that true leadership was not about being perfect or never making mistakes. It was about approaching each challenge with sincere intention to serve the highest good, learning from both successes and failures, and never losing sight of the eternal principles that gave meaning to all earthly actions. Outside his window, the first boats of the day were beginning their journey along the Nile, carrying goods and people to their various destinations. Soon, his own day would begin with the familiar rituals and responsibilities of kingship. But now, instead of facing these duties with resignation or anxiety, Kayamwaset looked forward to them as opportunities to practice the sacred art of righteous rulership. The weight of the crown would still be there when the servants came to dress him in his royal regalia. The difficult decisions would still require his careful consideration. The needs of his people would still call for his attention and resources. But all of these challenges would now be met with the understanding that they were part of a divine pattern much larger and more beautiful than any individual life. In this state of peaceful readiness, Pharaoh Kamwaset closed his eyes once more, not to return to sleep, but to center himself in the eternal presence of Ma'at that would guide him through whatever the new day might bring. The sacred balance that governed the universe was not a distant ideal, but a living reality that he could embody and express through every word, decision, and action of his reign. The first light of Ra's sun began to fill his chamber with golden radiance, and with it came the quiet certainty that today, like every day, would offer new opportunities to serve the eternal good that gave meaning to all existence. Chapter 4. The Dawn of Understanding. As the full light of morning filled his chamber with golden warmth, Pharaoh Kamwaset rose from his bed with a heart transformed by the night's visions. The dreams of wisdom from his predecessors and the teachings of Ma'at had woven themselves into his very being, creating a tapestry of understanding that would guide him through all his future days as Egypt's ruler. The familiar sounds of the palace awakening reached his ears. The soft chanting of priests conducting morning prayers, the gentle conversation of servants preparing for the day's duties, the distant calls of birds greeting the sunrise from the palace gardens. But now these everyday sounds seemed to carry deeper meaning, each voice contributing its part to the great symphony of Egyptian civilization. As his personal servants entered to begin the daily ritual of preparing him for his royal duties, Kamwaset noticed how their movements had a kind of sacred rhythm. The careful way they handled his ceremonial garments, the respectful manner in which they approached their tasks, the quiet pride they took in serving their pharaoh well, all of this was part of the web of relationships that made their society possible. "Good morning, Divine One," his chief servant said with a bow. But today, Kamwaset heard not just the formal greeting, but the genuine care and respect that lay beneath the ritual words. This man had served in the palace for many years, and his life was interwoven with the pharaoh's in countless ways. His family depended on the stability that good rulership provided. His children attended schools that royal patronage made possible. His daily work contributed to maintaining the dignity and effectiveness of the royal court. As they dressed him in the white linen robes that symbolized purity of purpose, Kamwaset reflected on how even this simple act carried profound meaning. The linen was grown by farmers along the Nile, processed by skilled craftsmen, and woven by artists whose families had perfected this trade over many generations. Every thread represented hours of human labor offered in service to something greater than individual need. The golden collar placed around his neck was not merely an ornament, but a physical reminder of the precious trust that his people had placed in him. The gold had been mined from deep in the earth by workers who understood that their dangerous labor contributed to Egypt's prosperity and stability. Master craftsmen had shaped it with techniques passed down through generations. Their skill preserving cultural traditions that gave Egyptian civilization its distinctive character. When the servants placed the uraeus, the golden cobra crown that symbolized the pharaoh's divine protection, upon his brow, Kamwaset felt not the weight of authority, but the presence of sacred responsibility. The cobra represented not his power to strike down enemies, but his duty to protect his people from all forms of harm. physical danger, economic hardship, social injustice, and spiritual confusion. As he walked through the palace corridors toward the throne room where his daily audiences would begin, Kemwaset observed the beautiful wall paintings with new appreciation. These were not mere decorations, but visual teachings that reminded everyone who saw them of Egypt's highest ideals. Scenes of pharaohs making offerings to the gods showed the principle of reciprocity that governed all relationships. Images of abundant harvests and peaceful prosperity depicted the goals toward which all government policies should aim. The throne room itself, which had seemed so formal and intimidating just yesterday, now appeared as a sacred space designed to facilitate the highest forms of human interaction. The soaring columns, carved to represent lotus plants and papyrus reeds, reminded all present that even the mightiest pharaoh drew his authority from the same natural forces that sustained every farmer's field. The ceiling, painted with stars, connected earthly decisions to cosmic principles that transcended any individual ruler's temporary preferences. As Kamwaset took his place upon the great throne, he noticed how its design encouraged him to sit with dignity and attention rather than casual comfort. The throne was not meant to be a place of ease, but a seat of service from which he could focus completely on the needs and concerns of those who came before him. The first petitioners of the day were a group of farmers from a village in Middle Egypt. They had traveled for many days to bring their concerns directly to the pharaoh's attention, and their dusty clothes and weathered faces showed the honest labor that sustained the kingdom. In the past, Kamwaset might have seen them primarily as subjects making requests. Today, he saw them as partners in the great work of maintaining Egypt's prosperity and justice. Divine Pharaoh, their spokesman said, kneeling respectfully, but speaking with the straightforward honesty of a man accustomed to dealing with practical realities. The irrigation channel that serves our village has become blocked with silt from last year's flood. Our crops are suffering, and we fear we will not be able to pay our taxes or feed our families if the problem is not addressed soon. As Kamwaset listened to their petition, he heard not just a request for help, but an opportunity to strengthen the bonds of trust and mutual support that held Egyptian society together. These farmers were not asking for charity, but for the infrastructure maintenance that would allow them to continue their productive work. They were not trying to avoid their responsibilities, but seeking the support they needed to fulfill them properly. Your concern is just and your request is reasonable, the Pharaoh responded, his voice carrying both authority and genuine care. The irrigation systems that serve our agricultural communities are the foundation of Egypt's prosperity. I will send royal engineers to assess the situation and coordinate with local officials to ensure the necessary repairs are completed before the next planting season. But Kamwaset did not stop with a simple administrative response. Drawing on the wisdom he had gained through his night visions, he engaged the farmers in conversation about their village life, their families, and their hopes for the future. He learned about innovations they had developed in farming techniques, challenges they faced that might affect other villages, and ideas they had for improving their community's prosperity. This personal attention transformed what could have been a routine administrative transaction into a meaningful human connection that strengthened both the farmer's loyalty to their pharaoh and the pharaoh's understanding of his people's real needs and capabilities. As the morning progressed, a steady stream of petitioners brought their concerns to the royal court. A merchant complained about unfair competition from traders who evaded taxes by bribing local officials. A widow sought justice for her son, who had been wrongly accused of theft by a wealthy neighbor. A priest requested resources to repair storm damage to his temple. Each case presented an opportunity for the pharaoh to demonstrate the principles of Ma'at through wise and compassionate judgment. With each decision, Kemwazet felt his understanding of effective leadership deepen. He learned to listen not just to the immediate requests being made, but to the underlying concerns and hopes that motivated them. He discovered that the most satisfying solutions were often those that addressed not just the specific problem at hand, but the broader patterns that might create similar problems in the future. When the merchant complained about tax evasion by his competitors, for example, Kamwaset could have simply ordered a crackdown on corruption. Instead, he used the opportunity to establish a new system of trade oversight that made tax collection more transparent and fair, while creating legitimate opportunities for merchants to compete based on the quality of their goods and services, rather than their ability to manipulate officials. The widow's case revealed problems in the local justice system that allowed wealthy individuals to intimidate poorer neighbors without consequences. Rather than simply overruling the false accusation, Kamwaset implemented new procedures that provided legal protection for vulnerable citizens and ensured that all accusations would be investigated fairly, regardless of the social status of those involved. The priest's request for temple repairs opened a discussion about the role of religious institutions in maintaining community stability and spiritual health. This led to a comprehensive review of temple funding that ensured adequate resources for maintaining these important cultural centers, while also establishing new programs through which temples could serve the practical needs of their local communities. As the day wore on, Kamwaset found himself energized rather than exhausted by these responsibilities. Each challenge successfully met brought a sense of satisfaction that came not from exercising power over others, but from helping to create conditions in which all his people could flourish according to their abilities and aspirations. The afternoon brought meetings with his advisors to discuss larger policy questions. The vizier presented reports on the kingdom's economic condition, including projections for tax revenues, costs of major construction projects, and the status of trade relationships with neighboring countries. The high priest shared observations about the spiritual health of the kingdom, including the effectiveness of religious education programs and the condition of temples throughout Egypt. Military commanders reported on the security situation along Egypt's borders, and the readiness of forces to respond to any threats that might emerge. Provincial governors described conditions in their regions, including local challenges that might require royal attention, and success stories that could be replicated elsewhere. In the past, these briefings had sometimes seemed overwhelming in their complexity and the weight of decisions they required. Today, Kaimwazit approached them with the confident understanding that he need not solve every problem personally or make every decision in isolation. His role was to ensure that Egypt's governmental systems functioned effectively and that the right people were in positions where their talents could serve the common good. The evening brought the pharaoh's favorite time of day, his walks through the palace gardens, where he could think quietly about the day's events and prepare for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. But tonight, instead of using this time to worry about unresolved problems or difficult decisions ahead, Kaimwazit found himself filled with gratitude for the opportunity to serve in such a meaningful way. The gardens themselves seemed to reflect the principles of good governance that he had been learning to apply in his royal duties. Each plant had its proper place and received the care it needed to thrive. But the overall design created beauty and harmony that transcended any individual element. Water flowed along carefully planned channels that ensured every area received adequate irrigation, while creating pleasant sounds and cooling breezes for human enjoyment. As he walked among the lotus pools that glowed softly in the evening light, Kamwaset reflected on the day's accomplishments. Every person who had brought a petition to the royal court had left with either a satisfactory resolution to their problem or a clear explanation of why their request could not be granted in the form they had hoped. More importantly, each petitioner had experienced personal attention from their pharaoh and knew that their concerns had been heard and considered carefully. The merchants would return to their businesses with confidence in a fair and transparent system of trade regulation. The widow would go home knowing that justice was available to people of all social stations. The priest would begin temple repairs with resources provided through a comprehensive system that balanced religious needs with practical community service. But beyond these specific accomplishments, Kamwaset felt that he had taken important steps toward embodying the kind of leadership that his night visions had revealed as the highest form of service to both gods and people. He had begun to experience the joy that came from using his authority not for personal advantage, but for creating conditions in which everyone could contribute their unique gifts to the common good. As night fell and the pharaoh prepared to return to his private chambers, he paused for a moment at the edge of the palace complex, where he could see the lights of Memphis twinkling in the darkness. Each light represented a family, a household, a group of people whose lives were intertwined with his own through the complex web of relationships that made civilization possible. Some of those lights shone from the homes of farmers who would rise before dawn to tend crops that would feed thousands. Others illuminated workshops where craftsmen labored late into the night, creating objects of beauty and utility that would enhance countless lives. Still others brightened temples where priests maintained the spiritual practices that gave meaning and hope to people facing the inevitable challenges of mortal existence. All of these lives, all of these activities, all of these contributions to Egypt's prosperity and culture were connected to the decisions he made and the example he set as Pharaoh. This was no longer a burden that weighed heavily upon his shoulders, but a source of profound meaning that filled his heart with purpose and satisfaction. As Kamwazet finally retired to his bed, he carried with him not the anxious anticipation of problems to be solved, but the peaceful confidence that came from understanding his role in the eternal pattern of service that connected all beings in webs of mutual support and care. The weight of the crown remained, but it had been transformed from a burden into a blessing, from a source of isolation into a means of connection, from evidence of personal sacrifice into proof of divine purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new chances to embody the principles of wisdom and justice that made human civilization a worthy offering to the gods who had created and sustained it. But tonight, for the first time since becoming Pharaoh, Kamwazet lay down to rest with a heart full of gratitude rather than anxiety. He had discovered that the sacred burden of leadership, when carried with wisdom and love, became not a weight that crushed the spirit, but wings that lifted both ruler and ruled toward the highest possibilities of human existence. The gentle sound of the Nile flowing past the palace walls sang him toward peaceful sleep, its eternal rhythm reminding him that he was part of something infinitely greater and more enduring than any individual life, something worthy of every sacrifice and every moment of service he could offer in return. As sleep embraced him gently, Pharaoh Kamwazet smiled with the deep contentment of a soul that had found its true purpose and learned to carry even the heaviest crown with grace, wisdom, and joy. In the morning, the sacred burden would be there to greet him once again. But now he knew the secret that had sustained every great pharaoh throughout Egypt's long history: that to rule others well, one must first learn to rule oneself, and that the greatest power comes not from dominating others, but from serving something greater than oneself with complete devotion and love.